Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So just a huge thank you to all of you who have been watching for the past month or so. Um, really appreciate it. If you do like this video, please leave me a like, leave me a share, give me a share, sorry, and leave a comment. I always read your comments, always get back to you guys. Really appreciate each and every one of you who do this kind of stuff for me. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscription button. It's always free, so I'll never ask you guys for money. And yeah, that's everything. So for today's case, I'm going to be discussing baby farming. In particular, one woman whose venture into this terrible crime made her a multi-millionaire, and she even got celebrity clients buying babies off of her. And sadly, this case isn't going to lead to a happy outcome. It hasn't led to a conviction because the person in question, she actually passed away before any of her crimes could come to light. So unfortunately, it's not going to lead to a happy outcome where we see her go to prison. But I still felt that her story and the story of the children that she abused and the children that she stole, I believe it was really important to still tell that story. So, with all that said and done, we're going to get into the story of Georgia Tann. Now, I'm hoping it's one that you guys haven't heard of. Maybe you have, I don't know. I certainly haven't heard of it until recently, and it kind of intrigued me, mainly because reading the list of celebrity clients that she had, and quite surprising, it was just kind of a weird correlation how this story came to my attention. I'll go into detail about that in a little bit when I get to that part of the story. But as always, we're just going to start from the beginning and who Georgia Tann was. So, her real name was Beulah George Tann. She went by the feminine version of her middle name, so Georgia, and she was born July the 18th, 1891. This was in Philadelphia, which is in Mississippi, and this was to parents Beulah Isabella and George Clark, and 3 years later they had her younger brother Rob Roy. Now, Beulah, the mother in this case, she was a high school teacher. Now, this was really rare for this time period because it wasn't a time period where women necessarily had careers. A lot of women would do things like factory work or other ventures. Obviously, sex work was the main thing in this time period, or other illegal ventures, just for them to obviously be able to make ends meet with their children. But factory work was the biggest thing that women tend to got in. So for a woman to become a high school teacher at this period of time is very unheard of. And her father, George, was a high court judge. He was said to have had quite a domineering personality, and he had higher aspirations for his daughter. So he wanted Georgia to become a concert pianist, and as soon as she reached 5 years old, he put her in for private piano tutoring. And this interest sort of followed Georgia into her adult years. The National Tennessean, so it reported that Georgia's home in Hickory, Mississippi, was a popular neighborhood gathering spot, and Judge Tann, he would also help out abandoned children. He would bring them home, give them refuge, Um, and he would often remark that he would need either ministers, high school teachers, or doctors to help figure out what to do with these children. Now, Georgia, as she was growing older, she attended Martha Washington College in Abingdon, Virginia, and she honoured with a degree in music. She took courses in social work at the Columbia University of New York, and this was for 2 summers. However, she at this time began losing interest in playing the piano, and she actually wanted to become a lawyer to follow in her father's footsteps. Now, under his tutelage, she read the law, passed the state bar exam in Mississippi. However, her father made it adamant he did not want her to follow this route because it was unusual for women to do this. So, with no apparent desire to have any children, to get married, she wanted to follow law. She excuse me. She took the only job that was available to her at the time to help fund her education, and this was health and social work. And this, again, wasn't really well known for women at the particular time. So she ends up graduating, and she briefly worked in Texas as a social worker, but she ended up quitting this profession fairly quickly. Now, in 1922, Georgia, she adopts an infant who she named June, and in a book, a woman called Barbara Raymond, so this book was written about the life story of Georgia, and Barbara recounted that the granddaughter, so the daughter of June, who was a girl called Vicky, saying that Mum said Georgia Tann was a cold fish. She gave her material things, but nothing else. I don't know why she even bothered to adopt her. And director of the Kate McWillie Powers Receiving Home for Children, Anne Atwood, who was the daughter of a family friend, she worked at the house as a house mother. She was 8 years Georgia's junior, and Anne had recently given birth to a son out of wedlock. Now, around this time, she changed her name to Anne Hollingsworth, and this was to give the appearance that she had been made a widow. And during this time, Georgia would also work as a teacher in a place called Itabena, and she went in September to teach throughout the winter, and she was accompanied by another teacher. Sometimes she would take Anne Atwood, or she would take her own little girl June. In 1923, Georgia and Anne spent the Christmas period with Georgia's parents, and this is when they actually became a couple. Again, obviously very difficult times, highly illegal in those days for anyone to come out as gay or lesbian, but Georgia and Anne were trying to make it work. But at the same time, Georgia, she was terminated on her contract due to her questionable childcare responsibilities. So in 1924, she ends up moving to Memphis in Tennessee with Anne, June, and then Anne's infant son, Jack. Now, in Memphis, she was hired as a secretary of the Shelby County branch of the Children's Home Society. The offices were located on the 5th floor of the Goodwin, Tennessee Children's Home Society, and this was the largest house in state, and it had branches in Jackson, Knoxville, and Chattanooga. Excuse me, sorry. Right, sorry about that, guys. Just had a bit of an itch going on. And she eventually took over the organisation using what author Robert Blade called an aggressive tactics. And in that same year was when Georgia began her child trafficking. So, Tennessee law at the time permitted agencies to place children with appropriate applicants. This was to ban the selling of children. And agencies could only charge for the services within keeping within the law. The society charged around $7 for adoptions within Tennessee, and Georgia also arranged the out-of-state private adoptions, for which she charged a more premium price. As many as 80% of these adoptions were to parents in New York and California. Adoptions in states such as Mississippi, Arkansas and Missouri, she actually arranged to be charged with $750. Records indicate that between 1940 and 1950, so a 10-year span, she legally stole and adopted out 3,000 children. In just those 2 states, she adopted out 3,000 children. Georgia enlisted the help of 2 other women, so they were called Alma Walton and Regina Waggoner, and they made a trip to these 2 places every 3 weeks with 4 to 6 babies each. Alma, she would go to California. Regina, she would go to New York. They would live out in hotel rooms. This was to meet with their prospective adoptive parents, and obviously all of these parents are incredibly wealthy. They had no problem affording the prices that Georgia was charging. So each couple would pay over $700 for the child in a cheque made out of Georgia Tann. Additionally, Georgia may have charged prospective parents for background checks, which she never bothered to pursue. Additionally, travel costs were at exorbitant rates. Adoption paperwork was 5 times the actual cost of the paperwork originally. The state of Tennessee itself was contributing $61,000 a year to Georgia's agency, with 31% of that money going towards the Memphis branch. The profits that she made were actually kept in a secret bank account, and this was under a false account name. And it was alleged that she pocketed up to 90% of the fees from the adoptions for her own personal gain. She failed to report the income to the revenue service, so she was making millions of this, and she was able to afford a really luxury, comfortable lifestyle for herself. Now, one of her most popular sort of things was going after young unmarried mothers, which at this particular time frame, as we understand, incredibly shameful to be that in the 1940s, 1950s, even way before that. And around this particular time frame, there would have been specialised homes for these young girls, and the girls would go in and have their babies, and the babies quickly were adopted out. Obviously, that was done through professional agencies. Georgia's wasn't that. So Georgia's modus operandi, she would take girls in to her homes. She would then quickly feign an illness after the baby was born. Sometimes girls would go in there in secret, so they didn't want anyone to know that they were actually having a baby, so they would run away in the early stages of pregnancy, hide out, come when they were heavily pregnant. And with Georgia's MO, she would tell them that the baby had fallen ill pretty quickly and actually died, And in that way she could secure a future for herself, because she knew that no one was going to bother to look for a dead child. She would then tell the parents that, you know, they would sort out burial and cremation and whatnot, and she'd give them like a fake memorial box with various ashes in it to make it look like it was their baby's ashes, when they weren't. And then obviously that particular child was then taken away and sold for an extortionate amount of money. And like I said, within 10 years, 3,000 children at that price. She very quickly became a millionaire through her own greed. So, it might surprise you that some of the notable personalities who used her service included the actress Joan Crawford. Now, obviously at the beginning of the video I said about what led me to this case, and it was this. So I come across some old Joan Crawford clips. I also come across an interview that Joan Crawford's oldest daughter did with Larry King. And I read parts of the oldest daughter's book. And I found out obviously that Joan had adopted all 4 of her children. So I started looking into Joan's history, and it led me to this. And the more I read, the more intrigued I became, and I just felt like I had to tell you the story. So it was literally just through watching old Joan Crawford clips that I come across this story. But Joan, she bore her twin daughters, Kathy and Cynthia, through Georgia Tann, whilst her older 2, Christina and her son Christopher, they were adopted through other professional agencies. There was also June Allison and her husband Dick Powell. They used the Memphis-based home for adopting their child, as did the adopted parents of professional wrestler Ric Flair. New York Governor Herbert Lehman, who signed us law sealing birth certificates from New York adoptees, also adopted a child through Georgia Tann. Other variety of methods that Georgia would use would be threats of legal action. She would turn the children over and coerce both parents into turning the children over. And one woman, a lady called Alma Sipple, she was one of the single mothers who'd given birth under Georgia's care. She described Georgia as a stern-looking woman with close-cropped grey hair, round wireless glasses, and an air of utter authority. The Georgia also arranged to take children from inmates who were under mental health assessments at the local hospitals, but also born to wards of the state through her connections. Now, obviously it might surprise you to learn that inmates at a mental health facility could get pregnant, but it has happened. I'm not going to lie and sit here and say that they're perfect places, because they're not, and even today many stories come out. A lot of people working in those places do abuse their authority. There's even stories about people in comas that are being sexually abused. So you can't pretend that these things don't happen, because they do. And, you know, women in prisons and in health authorities, they do get taken advantage of, and unfortunately some of them do end up pregnant. Georgia probably knew this as well, and she's going after these women in really vulnerable situations and taking advantage of them in another way. Because again, she knew that no one would believe them, and no one would go looking for these babies. In a 1937 government report by Emma Annie Winslow, a prominent American home economist and researcher, she reported that the 3 homes for unwed mothers in Memphis, in cooperation with the local health department, had committed to keeping mothers with their infants for at least 3 months before seeking adoption, especially into completing the breastfeeding cycle. They're not my words, by the way. However, all 3 homes reported that in practice, the children's homes would collect the children within 3 weeks due to court commitments. It was also reported that Tann had the practice of collecting children directly from their mothers at the hospital before the mum was even released to go home. Some mothers haven't even signed their children over under coercion from Georgia months before the child was even born. And Georgia said that she preferred to receive the children early before they developed thrush or any other kind of infections within the hospital. In even some cases, Georgia actually resorted to kidnapping children and selling them on, which I can't imagine ever happening, but this is what she resorted to. If she was running low on young women to scan and steal from, she was resorting to stealing children literally off the streets. So Emma also noted that between 1933 and 1934, while there were no maternal deaths between the 3 homes, there was a large number of infant deaths due to an epidemic at Memphis General Hospital. The author noted that the improvements in care at the hospital nursery had decreased infant mortality during the previous years, and ultimately concluded that the upstick in infant deaths must have come from non-resident mothers who had come to give birth in Memphis. The Georgia's method was to take children born to unwed mothers at birth, claiming the newborns required medical care. As I said, she would then later tell them that the newborn had died. When mothers asked about the children, they would explain that the babies had died or had been placed in foster homes and adopted. In some cases, single parents would drop their children off at nursery schools only to be told that welfare agents had come down and taken the children and the mothers had not been informed. Up until the point that they'd gone to go pick their children up. In others, children would be temporarily placed in an orphanage because a family was experiencing some sort of hardship, or they might have been experiencing an illness, and only to find out later that the orphanage had adopted them out or had no record of the child ever being placed there. She then destroyed records of the children who had been processed and conducting minimal background checks on the adoptive homes. As a result, the Child Welfare League of America dropped the society from its list of qualifying institutions. Many of the files of children were fictionalised, and this was before being presented to the prospective buyers and the prospective parents. They then would make up their own sort of background story, what they would tell their children in the future. If the rare occasion that an adoptive parent discovered the information on a child was incorrect, such as the falsified medical history, Georgia often would threaten the parents with legal action, and this would force them to surrender the care of their child. Georgia's threats were fulfilled with the aid of Shelby County Family Court Judge Camille Kelly. She used her position of authority to sanction Georgia's tactics and activities, and Georgia would identify children as being from homes that could not provide their care. And Camille Kelly would push the matter through her dockets, who also severed custody of divorced mothers. She would then forcibly take the children off the mothers and put them within Georgia's care for her to make a profit. She, in turn, Georgia, would arrange the adoption of the children into homes that were better suited. And this is basically, we know full well that it was nothing to do with the children, it was just literally just for her to make a profit. However, many of the children placed into homes where they were used as child labour on farms or within very abusive families, which wouldn't really surprise you guys. Didn't surprise me reading that. In a 1947 letter, Georgia's attorney, Abe Walder, said that the prospective adoptive couple had complete custody and control of the child for 1 year, may submit the child to any physical or mental examination they wish, and take any steps they desire to ascertain they have a healthy and normal child. If it is not, the Tennessee Children's Home takes it back without question. Bypassing the probate court, most adoption cases were handled in the counties of Dyer, Hayward and Hardeman. Georgia had also connections with former Memphis, Tennessee boss E.H. Boss Crump, who had an influential political presence up until his death. He had long been known to take bribes from unlawful establishments, so he would often go to brothels and gamble halls and make connections through those sort of places, which wouldn't have stood up in a court of law, but nevertheless, bribery is a big thing in politics. And sometimes some politicians, not all but some, they bribe quite seedy sort of places in standing up for them. And Georgia knew this, as she would use this fact to her advantage to make sure that she got away with what she did for so long. Georgia, she enjoyed a lavish lifestyle. She was respected within the community, because obviously the community, they would see her as this sort of angel figure. You know, she's giving parents what they want. They are getting the child that they've craved and they deserve and whatnot. They don't see the dark side of Georgia, and obviously it's the facade that she's going to want to put on to these people. So she was highly regarded wherever she went. Whilst in her care, the children that were left behind that took a while to be adopted out. They were very, very badly treated by Georgia. There were reports of neglect, physical abuse and sexual abuse, and even murder. And it's not sure how many children actually found their lives being ended by Georgia, but it was a well-known fact that she did take the lives of a few children. No housing facilities. The society held children that were awaiting placement in foster homes and public facilities. Now, the 30s had the highest infant mortality rate in Memphis, and this was mainly due to the Georgia Tann. In 1943, a wealthy businessman donated a mansion at 1556 Poplar Avenue to Georgia. The offices and intake rooms were put on the bottom floor, whilst the nurseries were then upstairs. She employed an all-female nursing team, and who all wore an all-white uniform, And these nurses in Warren's Wedding, these were untrained, uneducated women. And some of them were even substance abusers. The children were frequently sedated heavily, and those who were challenged to so those who were found to be challenging to find a place, they actually were either starved to death, or they would die of dehydration. Georgia regularly ignored doctors' recommendations for the sick children. She would deny them any care or medicine, and this meant that many of them ended up dying from curable illnesses, curable diseases. So while some of the victims were known to be buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, many of these children, many hundreds of these children, were never accounted for. And the exact number of the deceased children actually remains unknown. There is an estimate of around 500 children, but like I said, that's only an estimate. It could be way higher, it could be a little bit less, but it could be way higher. But at the moment, it is estimated to be around 500 children. Now, at the time, so-called black market adoptions, they were actually surprisingly not illegal. They were considered ethically and morally wrong, but not illegal. And reasons for that included the fact that young unwed mothers were often told they had to give it up because of societal shame. The suitability of the parents was often ignored. Information about the child's heritage was ignored. The medical history was lost, and adoptive parents were unaware of anything that could be potentially wrong with their child. However, by the late 1940s, things began changing. Lawmakers began to investigate the adoptions. They found support in public orphanages that were making fewer of their residents available for adoption. At that particular time, the head of the Adopted Children's Association of America was Georgia Tann. The Tennessee governor at the time, Gordon Browning, he launched an investigation into the society on September the 11th, 1950, after receiving reports that the agency was selling children for profit. He assigned Memphis attorney Robert Taylor to the case. 2 days later, the story was published in media nationwide, including the Memphis, Tennessee Commercial Appeal and the New York Times. The Welfare Commissioner, J.O. McMahon, accused Georgia and her cohorts of receiving as much as $1 million in profit. However, by the time of the news being made public, Georgia had quietly and secretly found out she had been diagnosed with cancer. This ended up being terminal, and she actually passed away 3 months before any of this was becoming public knowledge. So shortly before passing away, shortly after passing away, the state of Tennessee sued Tann's estate for $500,000. The case was settled out of court, with their beneficiaries paying 2/3 of her $82,000 estate to the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Now, Georgia's society was actually closed down in 1950, and the current Tennessee Children's Home is accredited by the state of Tennessee, but has no affiliation with Georgia Tann whatsoever, which obviously understandably is a good thing, and I don't know why they had to put that in there with the research, but It was kind of obvious that no way was going to have her name anywhere. That would be something that was good. In any case, she would be somewhere that would be labelled as bad. So I really don't understand why they put that in with the research, but I just felt like it was still had to be mentioned. Now, it's estimated that Georgia had stolen over 5,000 children. New York and California failed to take action, but it became too much and they couldn't possibly investigate all of these illegal adoptions because, like I said, much of the paperwork was destroyed. Parents were told their children, you know, different stories of what actually happened, so they weren't going to be forthcoming about the fact that they actually bought their child. You know, they would have told them that it would have been a blood-borne adoption, or possibly that they were actually biologically related. We never know, but you know, most of the parents wouldn't have been forthcoming. And there's probably people out there these days still alive now who were adopted out through Georgia Tann who don't have any idea of their background. Possibly. We will never know. So no children were actually restored in the medical histories and everything like that, and no children were actually returned to their original families. So like I said, Georgia died of uterine cancer just before the state filed charges against her society, so she escaped persecution. For her part, Judge Kelly, who she was believed to have been receiving bribes for ruling in Tann's favour, and whilst a 1951 report said that while she failed to, on many occasions, to aid destitute families and permitted family ties to be destroyed, she had not personally profited through Georgia Tann. She later resigned shortly after the start of the investigation, and she died in 1955, again escaping any sort of justice. So, starting over a several decades time span, the investigators began exhuming some of the bodies around the former children's home. Now, they couldn't obviously find every single one of them because they may have been buried in other places, but they, out of the estimated 500 children that had died, they managed to exhume 19 bodies. Now, these were actually given proper Christian burials. They were given their own sort of private lots, so they were buried together. And this was in Elmwood Cemetery. Now, this was with no headstone. And I think the reason for that is just so the bodies and the souls can be just laid to rest without any sort of public knowledge, so they don't sort of become a tourist attraction. You know, that they can just lay to rest without that sort of interference, which I think is a good thing personally, because obviously there are some morbid people out there that would probably want to see that and want them to have their names and whatnot, but I think being somewhere that they can just rest in peace properly, I think is better personally. Eventually, There was a monument to their memory erected in 2015. So this was around $13,000 that the cemetery did publicly raise. No names, again, I don't think there's any names on there. It's just to say a little something, but it's nothing too flash and grande. But they didn't have like separate headstones. In 1979, the state adoption legislation requiring the state to assist siblings who were trying to find each other. So obviously things like Long Lost Family, which is on now, this has been going on for years. People were trying to find out if one of their siblings could potentially have been a victim of George Tann. Well, a bill extending the provision to birth parents didn't pass. 1996, the state of Tennessee enacted Chapter 532 of the Tennessee Public Act, which revised the process of obtaining adoption records by releasing them to adult adoptees of the Tennessee Children's Home Society upon receiving permission from any living birth parent. Before the 20s, adoption was a rare process within the United States, with the Boston Children's Age Society placing only 5 children each year within adopted parents. By contrast, in 1928, or by 1928, Georgia had already placed 206 children in adoptive care. Believing in class distinctions, she felt that children should be taken from lower income families. So the whole, steal from the poor, give to the rich. She placed them with what she called people of the higher type. Because of George's insistence on choosing wealthy adoptive families, the practice of adoption became associated with the rich and the famous and the influential, and this obviously removed much of the stigma it previously had in American culture. Which is obviously with the list of the famous people that I read out earlier, so i.e. Joan Crawford. Even though Joan was considered box office poison, she was also incredibly influential. She was regarded as one of the greatest actresses of the golden era. Put aside, obviously, her personal life with her children, and obviously the abuse that she allegedly, because there's a lot of doubt surrounding Joan Crawford and the abuse that was reported to have taken place. A lot of people say that Christina's a liar, a lot of people say she's telling the truth. I don't really know, I don't know a wonderful lot. I have watched part of the film, I've read parts of Christina's book, I've seen her in interview, but whether or not everything happened, I do not know. I can't possibly sit there and tell you. But Joan, in any case, she still would have been given a real high class status by Georgia. So thank you for sitting through that with me, guys. Sorry it's taken a while to get this one out. I just wanted to do the due diligence. I don't know if you can tell from my voice, I'm not been feeling that well, so I apologise if I've not really been with it with you guys today. I'm just not feeling that great. You can probably hear the fan going on in the background. But in any case, I just want to say a massive thank you. Please like this video, share, leave me a comment. I do apologise if it seems to be all over the place. But I just really needed to get this video out for you guys and for myself. Thank you so much, and I really hope to see you guys very soon for the next true crime story with Silhouette. And as always, take care, stay safe.